Hi everyone, and welcome to Microsoft 365 May and the session on how to design the perfect team in Microsoft Teams with the 10 Ps. My name is Paul Woods. Before we get into the content, I'd love to first of all thank our sponsors for Microsoft 365 May. Without their help, we wouldn't be able to put together an amazing event. And special thank you to Beck and Lorraine and Megan, who've done an amazing job of pulling the event together as well. One of the really exciting things from my point of view is being both an Australian and a New Zealand citizen, the fact that we can have a conference that spans across both those countries. And it's amazing to kind of be able to do that in a way that kind of respects the culture of both those lands as well. So thank you to the traditional owners and recognise them both here in Australia and over in New Zealand as well. And for those of you who haven't seen the Code of Conduct yet, please, I actually really appreciate events where we have code of conducts in place like that, so it sets the expectations right up front. If you've got any questions or anything like that, please feel free to put them into the chat, into the Q&A. I'll take them all on face value. I won't read anything into them or anything like that. But yeah, just make sure that you can ask me tough questions if you want to. I'll recognise that as well. So let's get into it. I might put myself on the screen. Hey, it might make a bit more sense, so you can see me. So hey everyone, I'm Paul. I'm the founder of a company called Adopt and Embrace. And for the next 29 minutes or so, I get to spend time with you talking about something that's been near and dear to my heart for probably the last 2 years as we've been working on this, and it's the 10 Ps of Microsoft Teams design. And what I want to do is give you a bit of a context as why we built this framework and why we think it's so valuable and why we ultimately put it together in a book to make sure we could share this idea with as many people as possible. When Microsoft Teams first came out, just over 3 years ago now, we had a look at it and we could see the value of the technology straight away. And I think a lot of people could see the value of the technology straight away. Like the video quality was far better, the meeting experience was far better than what we had in Skype for Business previously and things like that. It brought together some of the stuff that we were using Yammer for a little bit in our business anyways, and we could kind of structure it in a different way in Teams, which made sense for us as well. But as we went and started talking to customers about Microsoft Teams, and after they had their first impressions of what the tool set could do and things like that, there was a lot of common questions starting to come from our customers. And there's some of the questions that you're probably hearing within your organizations, the questions you've had yourself over the past little while. So for example, when should I create a team? How many teams should I create? What is the right number of channels to have in a team? Should I have 3 channels or 25 channels or 100 channels? Should I have lots of teams or as few teams as possible? What should I name my teams? So all these questions were starting to come out from the customers that we're working with. And after getting punched in the face by our customers for like 6 months, I think kind of trying to answer these questions, we started to see some patterns emerging in how we would answer those questions. And from that's kind of where this 10 Ps framework came together, because we're thinking about what are the common things that we're talking about with our customers that are guiding them to create and structure teams in the most effective way possible. Now, the 10 Ps themselves started out as the 3 Ps, the first 3, so problem, purpose, and people. So we need to have a clear problem that we're solving when we want to bring people together in a particular collaborative space that we're creating. We want to have a really clear purpose to understand why we're coming together, and that purpose really ties quite nicely to the name of the team, so it's really clear what that team is for. And then people, we need to know who needs to be involved, because that comes down to information security issues in terms of who has access to what and things like that. So we used those first 3 Ps for a while, but as we kept talking to customers more and more, we realized there was more depth and more nuance to this that we needed to think about. So over time, the 3 Ps became 7 Ps, then became 9 Ps, and then became the 10 Ps that we put together in the book and in the presentation that we're talking about today. Now, I'll quickly mention the book. Some of you might have seen the book, some of you might have purchased the book. Thank you so much if you have. For those of you who haven't, everything that I'm talking about today is basically covered in part 2 of the book, Adopt and Embrace Microsoft Teams. So if you want to dive into any more detail, you want to see fully worked examples of how we've applied this framework in common scenarios across organizations, you can grab it on Amazon, you can grab it on in your local book retailer if you want to support a local business. You can get it from teamsbook.info as well. One thing we will be doing in the session today, we're going to give away a copy of the book as well to the best question. So we've got the Q&A section in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. If you just pop in questions throughout the presentation, and between Beck and myself, who's helping me produce the event today, we will pick the best question and we'll ship a copy of the physical paperback to you, irrespective of whether you're in Australia or New Zealand or anywhere in the world. We'll get that to you as well, so for the best question. Excellent. So let's talk about the 10 Ps. And what I might do is just move myself to the other side of the screen, so I'm not in the way there. So just to reiterate, the 10 Ps of Microsoft Teams design, we see this almost like a Rosetta Stone, like a framework that you can use to talk to anyone in your business, whether they're in IT, whether they're in the business, whether in HR, operations, or finance, or the CEO, whoever it is, to talk about how to structure a really impactful team where you can bring people together to communicate, collaborate, and coordinate activities or work processes within your organization. It's not necessarily technology specific. You could actually probably apply this to any collaborative tool, other competitive tools to Microsoft Teams as well that kind of start to do similar things of what Teams can do. But what we wanted to have is a framework that you could use to have a consistent conversation with whoever you're talking to help structure the perfect team. So what I'll do, I'll go through each of the 10 Ps one by one, give you a little bit of an introduction to what those 10 Ps are. And then what I'll show you is a resource that we've produced that's available for you to use in your organization as well, to help you actually sit down with people in your organization and work through this framework as well. So let's get into it. So as I mentioned in the introduction, the first 3 Ps is where we started this: problem, purpose, and people. So when you think about a problem, if you think about any significant change that you've made in your life, whether it's to try to reduce some credit card debt, or get fitter, or try and do something new, almost always that change in your personal life is grounded in some kind of problem that you've recognized. So if you're trying to reduce credit card debt, the real problem is that you're drowning, you're overwhelming from a financial point of view. If you want to get fitter, it might have been because you're walking up a hill and you're getting puffed at the top of the hill. You're kind of recognizing there's a problem or some symptoms that exist in the first place. And because you've grounded your decision in that problem or those symptoms, it's far easier for you to make the change, but also reinforce that change long term. So when we think about designing a team in Microsoft Teams, we're not just thinking about taking all the bad behaviors or all the behaviors we used to have on email and shift them in the teams. We're actually wanting to improve the way we work as a team or a group of people within the platform. So recognizing the problem that we're trying to solve is a really key part of that process. Now, the thing with the problem that you're recognizing, they're kind of laying the groundwork for how you design the team, it needs to be a problem that's legitimate and rational. So it's a problem that people actually believe in, and it's one that's real. It's a real problem that needs to be solved. Because if we don't believe in it, then it's not going to have the impact of helping us sustain that adoption or the usage or the change in behavior that we're looking for long term as well. The second P is purpose. And bringing people together, yes, we're going to solve a problem, but we need to make sure we're all aligned around a clear purpose of why we're coming together, what we're trying to achieve in this particular space that we're setting up for this collaboration exercise that we're going through. And the best thing about purpose, once you all kind of align and agree on a purpose, it's actually a really great analog to the name of the team. So if you have a really clear purpose, if you can represent that purpose in 50 characters or less, that's almost the perfect name for the team, because everyone who looks at that team can understand exactly what we're going to do in that space and almost how we're going to do it as well, just based off the name itself. It also helps from an IT point of view, because you can clearly see, if you're kind of looking at the list of all the teams you've got there, it's very difficult to distinguish between marketing team and HR team and like a subset of a HR team, a subset of a HR team or something like that, or Paul's team 1, Paul's team 2. But if we have a team that's named around the purpose of the group coming together to use that particular space, it's very clear to other people or outsiders who don't have that context to understand exactly what's going on in that particular space. So again, if you're clear on the purpose, you all agree on the purpose of why you're coming together, try and capture the essence of that in a name that's 50 characters or less. That's the perfect team name that you could use for your team that you're setting up. The third one is around people. And when you think about people, obviously we need to understand who's going to want to work in the particular space that we're working on. And this is really important from a focus point of view, but also from a security point of view. And we have a philosophy that says that, I could be a member of lots of different teams, but I only want to be members of teams that are relevant to me. I only want to see work that's relevant to me. If I'm a member of teams where there's lots of irrelevant conversation, irrelevant work going on, that's going to detract from the experience that I want to have and distract my energy from the work that I actually should be focusing on as well. So I want to make sure we're kind of minimizing it to the people that need to be involved in this particular space. The second thing is that it helps us from a security point of view. So, and this is where we can get into complexities around, whether we have separate teams or private channels or things like that as well. So when we look at the people in a group, what we want to think about is, do they all have the same information security need? And in a lot of your teams, that will be the case. So everyone, let's say you're working on a project and everyone has the same level of access to all the project documentation. That's great. That's really easy. We can bring them together. But say if you have different information needs across that group, so maybe you have some team leaders that should have access to the budget information and the rest of the team shouldn't have access to that budget information. So you've got one subgroup of those people that have a different information security need. That would be a great example where you could potentially create a private channel and have that information security need kind of captured in that private channel itself. But what if you have like 2 different information security needs or 3 different information security needs or more, where you've got different cohorts of people within that team that have different levels of access required? And that's one of those situations where it might make more sense to break it actually into 2 separate teams or 3 separate teams to help control the security around those different things as well. So if we recap on those 3 things, we think about problem, purpose, and people. Problem, we need to start with something that we all agree is a problem that needs to be solved. Purpose, we need to be really clear about why we're coming together in this space, and we could name the team around that, and then being really clear about the people that need to be involved in that group as well. Now, these three P's are really helpful to help us structure our teams, basically to answer the question of how many teams should we have or how many teams we should create. And a fundamental philosophy we kind of recommend is that you should try and solve 1 problem per team, you should have 1 purpose per team, and you should have one cohort or 2 cohorts of information security needs within a team. So if you try to solve 3 or 4 different problems with one team, in the long run, it's probably better to actually break that into 3 or 4 different teams. If you have like cross purposes or different purposes that you're trying to achieve in the same team, you should probably break that into separate teams, 1 for each of those purposes that you might have, and so on and so forth. When we get to priorities is about as a group of people together, what are the things that we want to focus on as a group? And normally if we did this workshop live or talking about this live, we would ask questions like, to the audience, how many priorities could you focus on at any one time? And if you want to have put it into the chat if you want to, you're more than welcome to put your answer to the chat. How many priorities can people focus on at once? Some people would come back to us and say, look, you can only focus on one thing at a time. And other people would come back and say, look, we could realistically look at 20, 30 things at a time and keep kind of all the plates spinning and thinking about things in that way. But if we look at the evidence, we look at the science or the literature behind, how teams work together and the performance of teams and things like that, the sweet spot is somewhere between 3 and 7 priorities on a group. Any fewer than 3, you're probably not getting the focus that you need. Any more than 7, you're probably too diluted in your efforts and you're not going to get everything done that you're looking for. We think thinking about the priorities of your group or the team that are coming together is really important, and those priorities map really nicely to the channels that you can create in your team. So if you think about the problem you're trying to solve, the purpose of why you're coming together and the people that are involved, think about what are the priorities of that group to achieve that purpose and solve that problem. If we have 14 different priorities that come up, then that might actually make sense to break that into 2 different teams as well, because we want to try and max it out at 7 or 8 different priorities that we focus on in each team at once. That also has the added benefit of allowing you to get better control over your notifications, better control over which teams you're a member of, because you only need to be in the member of the teams where you're more likely to have focus on the priorities that you want to focus on as well, which is great.
Paul, Rebecca here. We've got a few questions in the chat if you'd like to take some now.
Cool, excellent. So I'm looking at the shortest one first, which is from Dave. How do you distinguish?
Yeah, I was doing the same thing.
How do you distinguish when to include external people to be included in a team or channel? Great question. I think ultimately, irrespective of how you design the team, if you have a need that requires someone external into the team and your information security policies allow you to have guests, then I think there's no issue with having external guests in a team. But you need to be really clear about, and this comes out in that people priority, understanding, who needs to have access to what. So if that external guest can have access to everything that's in that team, that's really simple and really straightforward. Give them access and you can see it. If they have a different information security need than the full-time employees or the employees that are part of your organization, that's where you might need to consider, using things like private channels to kind of segment what's accessible to those guests, or setting up a second team, which could be just for that external collaboration that you're doing in particular. One of the things that we absolutely do recommend, though, is if you do have external people coming in, go back to step 2, that purpose one, and particularly around the name of your team. Add like a open brackets, EXT, close brackets as a prefix at the start of the team name. So everyone's really clear there's an external participant or external participants in that space, and it helps IT kind of see that a bit more clearer than some of the other flags that you might see within teams along the way as well. So yeah, that's a good question. Let me see one of the other questions here. So from John, I work for a corporate that locks down their Teams environment. I'm running a project across one partner channel, including vendors, partners, etc. I want to create a Teams channel for both internal, but mostly multiple external businesses. I want to create a community for success through chat, messages, sharing and co-authoring content, video meetings, etc. What is the best way to create this team as a private channel through guest access or federation? Good one.
That's a chunky one.
That's a chunky one. We might park that one and come back to that one because it'll probably take me down a rabbit hole that won't be in the rest of the presentation, but I might get back to you directly on that one. Okay, so Rich has a question. So how do you remove yourself from a team I've been added to that has no relevance? That's a great question. You have the ability to leave a team whenever you want, or if you don't want to leave it or you can't leave it because of the way that the team's been set up, you can hide the team so it doesn't appear in your list of teams as well. So there's a way to get out of that as well. What about using channels for the multiple problem? Good question. We'll come back to that in a second. Anonymous, I don't know who that was that asked that question, but we can come back to that one as well. And then the last one from Chris, how do I stop chat notification pop-ups for Teams meetings of more than 10 people like this one? Good question. We can come back and talk about notifications at the end. That's actually one of the 10 Ps we'll talk about shortly. So we'll talk about that one then as well. Excellent. So let's talk about the next one, which is principles. Actually, it's quite a nice segue to the notifications question from Chris as well. And so when you think about principles, we need to come together as a group that's creating this team or setting up this team and agree on like how we're actually going to use this space. What are the expectations we're placing on each other in terms of what we're going to do? So the principles could be down to things like what is the expectation of how often people will come and check into this space and reply to messages. So we might have an SLA that says, look, for this particular team that we've set up, the expectation is you'll check in here once a day for messages and reply to them. There might be some other teams you set up where it might be a week, like it's a slow moving process or something like that. So you don't need to be in there every day answering questions, but when you get a chance to, you can go in there and read the questions or things like that. Now, in the context of running an event like M365 May, where there's lots of information like in the lead up to, when you're doing a presentation or delivering a presentation, it might mean you need to be in there every couple of hours to keep on top of the conversation that's occurring there. So we need to come together as a group and understand, like recognize and agree what are these principles of how we're going to work together. Now, there's lots of different things we can talk about here. It could be expectations around how often we're going to read messages. It could be like how are we going to use notifications and app mentions. So we recommend like you don't use app mentions when you're replying to someone. You only use app mentions when you actually want someone to take some kind of action. So some kind of time-bound action, that's when you want to use an app mention. But just saying, hey, have you seen this message or something like that, that's not a really good use case of an app mention, because that helps that individual triage all the notifications that are coming in that you're trying to engage with. Another one is around like, what does a thumbs up mean? Like giving a thumbs up to a message. Does it mean that I've read the message? Does it mean I acknowledge the message? Does it mean that I approve the message? So making sure we've got a shared meaning and a shared understanding of all these different things that kind of appear in the Teams environment is really important. Now, other ones could be, as a group, and this one I think we would have all experienced this over the past 6 weeks, coming to a clear understanding about when are we going to have video meetings and when we're not going to have video meetings. Our philosophy is we want to reduce as many meetings as possible. We want to maximize the richness or the impact of those meetings. So making sure we've got video on and everyone's joining from a camera individually as opposed to going into a room and getting around a table and joining from a camera, those kinds of things. And then the last one you can think about is, what does an important message mean? Does that mean, is it something we can use all the time? Is it really saved for emergencies? What does that emergency actually look like, or that important thing actually look like? So coming together and all that, and then documenting those things, so everyone who joins the team later on is clear about what those expectations were when we created the team in the first place. And this kind of aligns quite nicely to that, forming, storming, norming model that you might have heard about in terms of teamwork in the physical world. We can do the same thing in the digital world as well. Okay. So let's go to the next one, which is plugins. Plugins is kind of thinking about what are the different tools or tabs or other things we could add into the team add to a channel that'll help us achieve the purpose that we're trying to work on here. And for most people outside of technical use cases, The most common thing we think about with plugins is the tabs that you can add in a channel. And the most common plugins that we see being used, and if you went to the swoop session previously to this one, you would have heard them talk about some of the data in terms of which plugins are being used or tabs are being used. But the browser tab or the website tab to frame in like online services or other online applications that start with a HTTPS, the Excel tab, the PDF tab, the Word tab, they're the kind of the common ones that we're seeing used in organizations. So think about how you could bring in the applications or documents or spreadsheets into that collaboration space that you're working with regularly as well. In terms of permissions, this one comes down to a little bit around, what are the roles and responsibilities of the team owner, and then how are we going to set up the controls in the space to make sure that people do what we want them to do in that space or not. So what permissions do team members have as opposed to the team owners? What permissions do guests coming into the team have that the team members or the team owners don't have as well? It could come down to like setting some of the settings that may not be set by your corporate IT team as well. So like what level of GIF rating do we want it? Do we want mature, PG, general consumption ones, things like that. But basically, just having a conversation around like how do we want to control some of the settings that we have in the particular team as well. So that's permissions. Performance is really thinking about, well, what does success look like? Like if we create this space, what does that future vision look like in terms of, will we have been successful in the way we wanted to change the way we work together, how we wanted to improve this business process using Teams or whatever the particular purpose is that we've come together for. So when you're thinking about performance, it could be something that's pretty common we see, which is we want to reduce the amount of email that we have. So you may be putting some goals in place that we can all agree to in terms of we want to, the goal is to reduce internal email by 75%. So if we're all clear about what the success metric is, the goal is of how we're coming together, that's going to help drive some of the behaviors of our team as well. We're not going to be sending an email or forwarding an email to individuals that are not part of the team. We're going to bring that into the team itself, so we can have the conversation there, so on and so forth. So being really clear about what we're trying to achieve as a group and how we could measure that, so we can see if we're making progress towards that goal, is important too. In terms of provisioning, we see there's kind of 4 different ways you could provision a team, kind of generically. And depending on how you've got your settings set up in your organization, there'll be different ways you could do this as well. So for example, you could do the more laissez-faire approach where anyone in your organization can create a team. You might have something called an IT assisted process where you have to put a service desk request in or put a ServiceNow request in or something like that to have a team provisioned for you. You could have templated teams if there's common structures that you want to use for like projects or other things. You can have them templated, ready to go with the right channels and things like that. Or you could completely automate the provisioning of your teams as well. So say once a project is approved in your project management system, there's a trigger that automatically provisions the team for that particular project as well. So there's a few different ways you can provision teams, and when you're sitting down with people in your business to help understand how to create the team and set it up in the first place, these options will kind of help guide you in terms of what's possible or what's not. We definitely don't recommend trying to go the automated path or the templated path straight away, because you want to get some feedback from people actually using this technology and applying this technology with real world business problems in your organization to help inform what those templates should look like or inform what that automation should look like as well. And then after provisioning, we actually got to 9 Ps when we created this. And we thought, we can't have 9 Ps, we've got to have 10 Ps. We need to have some kind of round number to bring this together. And after thinking about lots of words that start with P, perishability came into our mind. And it was a little bit of a joke to start with because of that, but it actually turned out being one of the most important things that we think about in this framework. And that is, what are we going to do when this is all over? What are we going to do to make sure we capture this intellectual property, capture this knowledge that we've created in the team? How do we make sure it goes into our records management system or a system of record? What are we going to do around archiving? When should this team be deleted? All those kinds of things. So we want to make sure that when we're setting up a team or designing a team, we're thinking with the end in mind, and we're putting that down in writing in terms of a plan that we're going to work through as well. So there are 10 Ps at a high level. Again, we could summarize that in one line for each of them. So problem is, what is the problem that's trying to be addressed? Purpose, what is the purpose of the team? People, who do we need, who do we want, or who do we need to collaborate with? Priorities, what are the 5 to 7 things that would map nicely to channels? Principles, like what are we going to use a general channel for? What does a like mean? What does an app mention mean? Things like that. Plugins, how are we going to use the tabs, like the website tab, the OneNote tabs, PDFs, things like that. Who should have access to what when we think about permissions? In terms of performance, what does success look like? Provisioning, who's responsible for getting it set up? How we can potentially template or automate it? And then perishability, how are we going to capture lessons learned? What are we going to do when it's all over? There's 10 things that we think, and we can kind of answer all those questions 1 through 10. then you've got a really clear plan in place. You could probably work through 95% of the team's use cases using that exact process there. Yes, there will be a few exceptions that you might need to think outside of these 10 Ps, but that'll generally cover most of the things you need to consider when creating a team. Now, I know that there's a competition going on, so I'll leave that on the slide for a second before we go into the workbook that you can use as well. So make sure you take a snap of that if you're trying to win some prizes. I might just leave that up there for a second. And I'll look at the questions while that's there. Any teams?
Yeah, we've got a few chunky questions in there, and some that I think you might have covered, but just gloss over them in case it needs more detail.
Cool. So Anthony, in the context of having teams with specific focus, how do you help people in many teams deal with having lots of things to review? That's a great question, Anthony. Look, for us, it comes down to using some of the signals in the user interface to help you manage that. So myself personally, I'm a member of about 126 teams within Adopt and Embrace. But we use these signals to help us manage and triage our focus across all those different teams. So one of those principles we talked about before, only @mention if you want someone to actually do something. That means that as a group, we all recognize if someone tags us in a post, that's our #1 priority to look at. So we will go based on that decision that we've made, that agreement we've made. If anyone tags me in a post, that's my top of my priority list to go through in terms of looking at things in teams. But once I go through that, the expectation is that anything else that I want to view in teams or anything else that's posted in teams is basically based on my own decision making. I have the authority to decide when I want to read things or not read things, irrespective of who I am in the business. So I can look at teams. If I've got them all the teams minimized, so I don't have all the channels expanded, but it's all minimized, I can see very quickly from a visual cue, which is like the team name will be bold, whether or not there's been any new activity in that team. And then what I do is just look at all the bold teams and say, well, am I going to think about any of those things today? Do I need to think about any of those things today? There's no actions there because I can't see any mentions for me. So when I have the right time and the right headspace, I might look at that particular project or that particular customer when it's right for me, as opposed to having to be on top of everything all the time. So by actually having more teams, it allows me to have a stronger filter and be able to triage much more effectively to focus on the things that I actually want to focus on, not on the things that everyone else wants me to focus on. And the mentions is a kind of shortcut that we use that if we want to get someone's attention to look at something specifically. So what I might do, I might keep going on. I'll just walk you through the work, but I'm just conscious of everyone's time. So I want to make sure I get through a bulk of the content by 2:30 or 4:30 New Zealand time. I'm happy to hang on for a few more minutes afterwards and go through the questions as well. So I'll just make sure we get through that. So we'll come back to that later. So in terms of structuring your team, again, this is a workbook that's available for anyone to use on the call. We've licensed it under Creative Commons, so you can take this and use it in your organizations as well. But it's basically a follow the bouncing ball workbook that you can go through to help sit down with people in your business to kind of work through the design of a perfect team. So step 1, what is the business problem or opportunity you're focused on? Write that into the box, and a little bit of a checklist here. So if it's a problem that's both logical and rational, everyone would understand, yes, then we can move to step 2. If not, we need to start refining that problem and what it looks like. And the little blue tip behind my head there is that we should try to only solve one problem at a time per team. Step 2, what is the purpose of it coming together? If we can articulate that in a verbose way, that's great. But how would we summarize that in less than 50 characters? Because that could be a perfect team name that we could use for creating the team. Can we clearly distinguish the purpose of the team based on the name that you've proposed? If yes, we can move on to the next one. If no, we need to refine it to get a bit better. And again, each team should have a single purpose. That just helps with the triaging and the filtering that I just explained in that response to Anthony before. Who are the right people to be part of the group? So let's list all the people that need to be involved. Are any of these participants external to the organization? We want to make sure everyone knows that. So let's go back to step 2 and add that, open brackets EXT at the start of the team name to make sure that everyone's really clear there's external participants there. If there's any subgroups with different levels of access, if there's just one, we could move ahead. If there's more than one, we could either use private channels or split it into 2 different teams. Our recommendation, if you've got 2 or more different subgroups of people, it's better just to break them out into separate teams. It's going to save you a whole heap of information and data security nightmares down the track. In terms of priorities, every group would have lots of priorities. It's good to kind of talk about them as a group. And then the top priorities that you come together with, they should map really nicely to the different channels you could create in your team. Remembering that if you want to prioritize your priorities, which is what we're trying to do with priorities in the first place, I guess, you can put a 1, 2, 3, 4 in front of the channel name. Remember, the teams will sort them in an alphanumeric order, so you can kind of force some channels to be at the top of the list as well there. When you get to 7 or 8 priorities, that's probably the time when you should think about whether or not you could get a more refined focus on a purpose or something like that and split it into 2 different teams potentially. In terms of forming your team, again, when we talk about principles, what are the principles we're going to agree to? One that we didn't really mention before, but how are we going to use the general channel? Like, is the general channel going to be used for just talking about how we're going to work together in the space, or is it going to have a clear meaning that we're going to use that for as well? But at mentions like, if we're using webcams or not, that kind of thing, where files should live, how we're going to do meetings, etc., etc. One of the key things in step 5 here, it goes back to one of the questions before, is making sure that everyone has configured their notifications and quiet hours on their phones in particular to make sure it actually meets their individual needs. Because across your team, there's going to be different people that want to use Teams in slightly different ways, and they need to make sure that their notifications match that use case that they're looking for as well. Ideally, you want to document that in the team somehow. Normally, we would say put it into the general channel as a Word document or a PDF that's tabbed at the top of the general channel. So there's some consistency across all the teams as you go from team to team to see what the expectations are of that particular space that you're collaborating in. In terms of plugins, again, we can map the plugins to the different channels, whether you want to use tabs or connectors. I'd say 98% of our customers, tabs is what basically that's all that's being used here. There's very few people using connectors at the moment or getting much value out of connectors, apart from specific use cases around some IT use cases with service ticketing systems and things like that. But generally, it's all about the tabs. And don't forget that website tab or the browser tab is so powerful. Basically, for any online platform that you're using that starts with HTTPS, you can deep link to projects, to customers, customer records, and CRMs. You can do lots of different things using that browser tab. So think about how you could apply that, or that website tab. Sorry. In terms of permissions, what is a team owner accountable for? In some organizations, we want to make sure it's really clear that they are making sure that files go into records management systems or other systems of record. So we'll kind of give that accountability to the team owner in a lot of cases. But what are the other controls we're going to put in place in terms of permissions in the team as well? Again, does your team owner actually understand how Microsoft Teams is governed by your IT team? For those that are in IT teams on the call, I'm sure you've got policies or some positions on how you want teams governed, but do your team owners actually understand those, and you kind of validated they understand those rules of the road that you put in place? Have you given them their team's driver's license, to make sure that they kind of understand exactly what's going on as well? How will we monitor performance? What does success look like? So again, putting those goals down on paper so we're all really clear about it. One thing to think about with success measures or performance is having a really great blend of both professional goals like KPIs that you might have in your performance plan or things like that, but also personal goals like increasing flexibility, getting out of the office on time when we went to offices, getting our lunch breaks back when we actually had to work through our lunch breaks and not just stuck into the kitchen to get things. Those kinds of that balancing the professional and personal goals is really important as well. In terms of provisioning, just how are we going to create the team? Will we do it ourselves? Will we get IT to help us? Or is there an opportunity to template this or make it automated sometime down the track? And then finally, what happens at the end? How will we capture the intellectual property and share lessons learned from the work we do in this team? What retention or archiving rules do we need to consider, particularly around this context we're looking at? And based on all that, have we then gone back and reviewed our team design to make sure we can meet all those requirements, yes or no? What are we going to do when it dies, basically, at the end of the day? And I think there's a great opportunity with Teams as people are starting to use it to create new knowledge and to create new ideas, to not only just think about archiving and retaining knowledge, but how can you repurpose and share that with other people? So how can you take lessons learned from a collaboration experience and turn that into a blog post or a Yammer post or a video you can push out a stream or something like that, to share that knowledge with other people as well. So we want to make sure that people are thinking about all those things when they create the team in the first place. So that goes through the bulk of the content for the presentation. Again, there's a lot more detail around that in the book. It's available on Amazon at your bookshop, and it just got released on Audible last week as well. So if you've loved my voice for the last 30 minutes, you can get another 4 hours and 27 minutes of it through Audible if you want to. I don't recommend it to anyone really. It puts my kids to sleep. It'll probably put you to sleep as well. But if you're interested in this content and diving a little bit deeper into it, you can get that book there as well. We will have a copy of that book. We'll give you the best question. We'll have a look through the rest of the questions in a moment, and we'll get in touch with someone after the call in terms of that prize as well. So what I'd love to do is just, again, thank our sponsors for the day. They help us put events on like this. So thank you to everyone else that's contributed to the event. And what I might do is just, we'll have a quick look at the questions. So let's have a quick through there. If you've got any other questions, feel free to put them into the questions now, but I'll just quickly go through them and see what we've got here. Okay. So Snow has asked this question. I'm a member of a team where the owner wants us to acknowledge by thumbs up that we have seen a message. Is this normal, and should this be covered by a principal? So I think that's a really great example of a principle that's been created. But I think in that case here, it sounds like the owner has created the principle on everyone else's behalf, and maybe the rest of the team haven't come together to agree on those principles themselves. We have seen that. We have seen that before. Is it normal? Normal is a loaded term. I'd say it's not frequent, but when there is frequency of it, it's a tendency for managers that might be a little bit more on the micromanager end of the scale, as opposed to more of the trusting their employees end of the scale. And I don't know the specific context, so apologies if that came across in the wrong way or anything like that. But generally, in most cases, we see it's where people want to know that people are seeing the message, want to know that a message is being communicated, and need to know that people have kind of listened to them. So it's not all that common, but we have seen it come across. One of the things you could do in that situation is, sit down with that team owner as a group, sit together and go, let's be really clear about the expectations. The reason why you want us to hit thumbs up is because we haven't been clear about, when people are actually going to come into this team and read those things as well. So you could sit down and go, right, we're going to agree that we need to look in here at least once a day. And everyone will have read every message in the team by the close of business every day. And that might be the expectation that you set with each other, which reduces the need to have the thumbs up to say that you've read the message. But then again, there may be some really specific circumstances where having that thumbs up to say you've read a message is really, really important based on the business process or the context of that particular situation. So it's not a blanket recommendation, but I'd say being clear about those expectations in terms of how people engage in the team should alleviate the need to have those kinds of circumstances where people need to press like on every single message to say that they've read it along the way.
Paul, before you go to the next question, just realising we're at the halfway mark, and there might be some people who need to jump off. We are recording. Do you want to stick around and go through the questions, and then people can loop back to the recording, or do you have another way you'd like to share answers with people?
Well, I can keep just riffing and answering all the questions that have come in on the side here. If people need to drop off the call, again, the recording will be available afterwards. You can come back and look at them as well. So we've got a few more questions, but there's not too many more here to go through.
Awesome, thank you.
That's okay. All right. Any tips for, so anonymous, any tips for when a team is no longer required, a project finishes, or team abandoned? Again, that comes back to the principles, the perishability P at the end. And there's some really good examples here where you might have a blanket approach in an organization that may not work for all scenarios. So for example, I like to use an example of like orientation week at university. Is an event that occurs, at least 2 times a year, maybe even more. You might have a blanket thing that says, if a team isn't used for 90 days, we get rid of it. But if I wanted to have all that knowledge there available for when I run orientation week in 6 months' time, and then 6 months after that, and then 6 months after that, generally, keeping that information and keeping that knowledge is really important, because we could reuse some of that IP and things like that. So I think there's always going to be exceptions to blanket rules in terms of how long teams should be available after they're dormant or not being used, because that could be very valuable information that people in the business need to use to get stuff done. I think it's important to think about that when you create the team, though. So what are we going to do when this we need to finish up using this space? Do we need to keep it for longer term, or would it be able to go away? Obviously, depending on the organization, and you have very specific information management or records management needs, you might need to consider. Some of you have legislative requirements in terms of that as well. So I think if you have a policy position at an organization level in terms of what the ideal is, but then be able to manage exceptions where that makes sense for your business, I think that's the best blend of both of those things as well. So Bertie has a question: what does success look like to you when you're looking at a successful team? So for me, this is an interesting one. I think the best way to think about this is when you're not chasing up people for stuff. That's probably that's a good sign of a team working together, or people aren't chasing you up for stuff. So that's a good outcome of lots of great teamwork behaviors coming together to be successful. Some of the measures, the success measures you might be thinking about now, we've achieved some of those in our own personal practice. So like we don't have any internal email at all. So reducing email is not a goal anymore, because we've already done that. So we think about more measures there. So it could be the experience of teamwork itself. But ultimately, it also means like, are we saving money? Are we saving time? Are we reducing risk? Are we getting a business outcome for the organization that we're working for? Are we achieving our KPIs? All those kinds of things. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a collaboration or a measure of communication or collaboration. It could actually be a measure of business success that you're thinking about as well. We've seen some teams that have saved companies millions of dollars, and I'd say that's an absolute success. We have seen teams that have helped, increase situational awareness, and as a result of that, reducing a whole heap of risk in businesses. And I'd see that as a really great success in terms of how that team's structured. But it's not just being used as a chat space. Like, there's a really clear purpose around how people are coming together, and they can clearly measure the success of that based on that purpose as well. So they're things I kind of consider when it comes to that. Scott, are there any additional tips for delegation of team ownership? So I think that's an interesting one. I think ultimately the owner of the team should have some clear roles and responsibilities and accountabilities. And I think as an IT team, you could dictate some of those things. But also I think that ultimately the team owner needs to be accountable for how that group comes together and how they do their work together. And like ultimately achieving the success of that particular space. So if you're going to delegate team ownership to people, first it's got to be people that could kind of handle that responsibility or that accountability and actually going to follow through with it. So that's probably the key thing that I think about there. The other thing, like, there's some really generic recommendations in terms of team ownership from an IT governance point of view. So making sure that every team has at least 2 owners that kind of have that accountability, and that just makes it nice and easy. Say if someone left the organization in a hurry, or exited the organization, or shifted teams, or didn't need to be involved in that team anymore, there's at least someone that can continue with that accountability moving forward until you can find an additional owner to add to that list as well. So I'd make sure that you get that level of detail in terms of being clear about your expectations of team owners as an IT team, if you're coming from the IT perspective. But if you are an owner of a team, you're creating that space for a clear purpose. You want to make sure you're achieving that purpose. So you should be giving that team ownership to people that kind of understand that and are working towards that particular purposing, and bring people together to achieve that purpose as well. Okay, so Julian, do you recommend using a generic sysadmin account to create teams, even if templated or self-provisioning enabled? Yeah, look, this is probably getting beyond, I don't know the specific technical details around this one, but I can give you a generic answer to this one. So just remember that as an individual, like a named user, there's a limit of how many teams that we can create. And I can't remember the specific limit. I think it's either 200 or 250 off the top of my head, but we can come back and confirm that. So as an individual, Paul Woods at adoptandembrace.com, I can produce 250 teams myself, if that's the number that I'm trying to recall. Any more than that, it won't let me create any more teams. So that's where you need to use some other accounts or other ways to do that. Now, administrators can create as many teams as they want. So maybe as part of your process, you have the team created by an administrator or something like that, which will help alleviate hitting those limits potentially as well. So hopefully that answers your question. Okay. Not a question. Thanks, Paul. I was already asking some of these questions when IT were asked to set up a team. I work in IT, but it makes more sense and gives me a framework moving forward. Fantastic, Snow. Your follow-on question, where is that document that we referenced, where you can find it? So the workbook that we talked about there. So for those of you on the call, I might actually just break into my browser on this other machine here. Just bear with me a second. I'm more smart in doing this on a device, but I don't have a keyboard attached to it, so I do it all through touch. Apologies. Go to Edge. Stop that presentation. All right. So I'll do this all live on my on-screen keyboard. Teamsbook.info. So TAMS. I didn't even spell it properly. We'll get there. Teamsbook.info. So this is the page for the book that we wrote, that Adopt and Embrace Microsoft Teams. So if you wanted to order some copies of the book, like in bulk for your organization, you can grab it here. But if you see at the top of the screen here, there's a resources button just beside the logo. It's got the logo on the left-hand side, then home, then resources. If you click on that button there, and it's about halfway down this page. So we can see that workbook there, which is in the middle of the screen. Adopt and Embrace embraces 10 Ps of Microsoft Teams design. You can see that there. Chris has thankfully put the direct link into the chat, so we'll just publish that so everyone can see that as well. But yeah, you can get it from the teamsbook.info/pages/resources. You can find it there as well. Okay. Have you seen any Teams disasters, and did the 10 Ps help remedy it? Now, I've seen plenty of Teams disasters, and I'm sure we've all seen plenty of Teams disasters. But it depends on how you define a disaster, I guess. So I've seen lots of organizations have maybe gone a little bit too fast with teams in some cases and haven't thought about the purpose of teams generally. Like, what is Teams' role? What is Microsoft Teams' role in the organization? And haven't been really clear about what that means. And that's meant that a lot of workforces have gone and just try to figure it out for themselves. And there hasn't been really any guiding principles in terms of how people are going to apply the technology to their work. And when that's happened, generally what we've seen is, there's been no controls in terms of who can create teams or things. And we see a lot of team sprawl in inverted commas, lots of new teams created or different teams created, serving different purposes, but no real clear consistency or structure or anything like that around it. And potential is to get a bit messy. And like we've seen, a healthcare customer here in Queensland, they launched Teams, and then 2 weeks later they had 700 teams with no real understanding of what it was being used for, or the purpose, or any kind of controls around it. And lots of these rogue teams being created where they clearly were either test teams or things that people had set up but didn't realize that set up other things in the Microsoft 365 environment, all that kind of stuff. So the 10 Ps in that kind of situation helps put some constraints and structure around how people think about designing the team and setting the team up in the first place. So even just as a vehicle to have a conversation with people and say, well, you've created a team, that's great, but have you actually thought about how you're using the team? Let's use this process to have a discussion with you. Let's talk through each of these different things and just get a feeling for what you're actually trying to achieve in your part of the business. So we've seen the framework used really well to help corral conversations and get some consistency in conversations and get people thinking about things they might not have actually considered when they created the team in the first place. The result of that being, a clear reduction in the amount of, sprawl in terms of teams that are being created, and more confidence in the people that you are giving permission to create teams with, that they're kind of following the same principles that you're thinking about as an IT team as well. Okay. And Jonathan, thanks for the information. One of the most practical sessions to date I've seen on managing teams. Very awesome. Thank you, Jonathan. Appreciate that. And I think the last question there, we've got one from Anonymous. So thank you, Anonymous, for your question. When a team comes to end of life and the goal has been achieved, it seems that Microsoft suggests that the entire team expire over time and is ultimately removed. I struggle with this because I see two sides. One side is to remove, save storage costs, reduce the noise, and keep things current. However, I also see value in keeping archived teams around as a knowledge base that is searchable. Is it possible another team figured out how to solve a problem we are currently encountering today? There is tremendous value in learning from previous experiences, but this approach could create tremendous dumping ground for significant expense. What do you think? Awesome question. Again, is one of the things why we have that perishability question in the 10 Ps as well. And for us, it's really like how are we going to think about or keep it top of mind? How do we continuously capture, curate, share the knowledge that we're creating in this team? Because the thing is, people might not need the raw data or the raw knowledge that's been created, the raw chat that's kind of gone on to create the knowledge, but they might want the outcomes or the output of the knowledge that's created in that team. So like how as a team owner are we thinking about how are we capturing this, curating this, synthesizing this, creating new knowledge and publishing that knowledge in other places where it can be stored? So it could be going into a records management system if that's the approach you have. It could be summarized as a Yammer post saying, hey, there's been lots of great work happening in this project. Here's some of the key lessons that we've learned over the last 3 months, and like here's the top things we learned. Like those kinds of things. Like I think there's a role of the team owner to help take the best bits, the stuff that's bubbling out of that team, that space you've created, and make sure that it is accessible to the rest of the organization. I'm kind of I kind of agree with you that there is immense value in that information, but knowledge, data, just capturing all the data, that can become overwhelming. We need people, and I think the team owners have a good role to play in this, to take the best bits out of that, make sure we're getting the most out of that information, and making it accessible and understandable for people in the workforce as well. One of the best use cases we've seen for SharePoint communication sites is exactly this. We set up a communication site where we can just share the best bits of the learning that's coming out of these different teams, and making sure that's accessible to everyone across the organization. Obviously bearing in mind some of the stuff that might be confidential that needs to be stored locally in that team and not make it out to the light of day as well. There's a session, I can't remember which day or month of M365 May, but one of my colleagues, Helen Blunden, is doing a session on building learning plans and things like that. And as part of that, she talks about some of the tactics you can do to share some of this knowledge as well coming out of teams. So it might be worthwhile having a look at that session as well. So with that, I think that's all the questions that we have on the chat. So again, thank you so much for everyone asking the questions. Thanks again for joining the session today. I'm doing one other session during M365 May that you might be interested in on May the 19th at 11:30 in the morning, I think it is. And it's a session on working when, maintaining work-life borders when you're working inside your life. So a lot of us are kind of experiencing the same thing that I'm experiencing right now. I'm coming to you live from my garage. I've been kicked out into the garage because my kids are working from home. I'm doing school from home. My wife's working from home as well. And there's a real struggle in these situations to maintain that balance between work and life. What's the strength of those borders between work and life? And we no longer have the the rituals of going to work. We don't get on public transport. We don't get into the car and drive to the office. We don't listen to that podcast for 30 minutes on the walk to the bus stop, all that kind of thing. So how do we manage those borders? How do we maintain the strength of those borders and ultimately have some kind of sense of a reasonable life where work isn't extending into our non-work time as much as it probably is now. I think one of the things many people recognize working from home is it's very easy to overwork the hours that you were expecting to do because it's so easy just to sit there at the computer or get distracted and go back to the computer and do your work as well. So on 19th of May, we're doing a session around that. It's all based on research that I did in my master's over the last 8 years or so. So it's kind of good evidence-based stuff in there. I'd love to share some of the lessons from that research with you. So on the 19th of May, you can look it up in the session catalogue for M365 May and see that around then. Register for it and come along. I'd love to see you there as well. But with
I just
that,
checked, Paul, the time for Helen's session. So Helen's session is on the 15th of May at 12 p.m, how to build your personal learning network.
Awesome. Sensational. But with that, thank you so much for your questions. We're going to have a look through those, and Beck and I, after the call, decide which one's the best one, and we'll be in touch to get a book out to the best question. Thank you so much for coming along, and I'll wrap up the broadcast there. Have a great afternoon.